Hey guys, tonight we begin with teenage girls in ancient Sparta, and trust me, you thought your high school experience was rough. Picture this: mandatory military training, public nudity contests, and your mom literally abandoning you in the wilderness to toughen you up, and that's just a typical Tuesday. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into the night's journey together into what might be history's most intense coming-of-age experience. Let's start with the biggest misconception about Spartan girls. Most people imagine them as delicate flowers, sheltered in their homes, learning to weave and cook like their Athenian counterparts. In reality, Spartan girls were basically ancient CrossFit athletes with a side of psychological warfare training. Think of it like comparing a suburban soccer mom to a Navy SEAL. Sure, they're both women, but one of them can probably kill you with a discus. This wasn't some feminist utopia where girls got equal treatment out of progressive values. It was a military machine that needed women tough enough to produce the next generation of warriors. If you thought modern helicopter parenting was intense, try explaining to a Spartan mother why her daughter came home crying instead of covered in mud in someone else's blood. 8th century BCE, Sparta was like if a military academy and a eugenics program had a baby and raised it on protein shakes and toxic masculinity. The Peloponnese wasn't some sun-drenched paradise where philosophers lounged around discussing democracy. It was a powder keg of competing city-states, each trying to outmuscle the others. The Spartans controlled this through their unique social system that made North Korea look relaxed. The Gerousia, basically a council of old men who'd somehow survived. Spartan childhood controlled every aspect of society, and the consequences of their decisions were literally life or death. If you thought modern parents were obsessed with their kids' college prospects, imagine a society where your 7-year-old's ability to survive military training determined whether your family line continued or got wiped out entirely. The helots, basically state-owned slaves, did all the actual work, leaving Spartan citizens free to focus on the important things: war, more war, and preparing for future war. This wasn't ancient Greece's version of summer camp. This was a society that looked at the concept of childhood and said, yeah, we don't do that here. The Romans, who weren't exactly known for their gentle parenting methods, looked at Sparta and thought, wow, these people have some serious issues. Meet Cyniska, daughter of a Spartan king, who became the first woman to win at the Olympic Games. But here's the twist: she never actually set foot in Olympia during her victories. Spartan women weren't allowed to attend the Olympics, but they could own the horses that competed in chariot racing. So Cyniska basically won through what we'd now call a technicality, which is the most Spartan thing ever: finding the loophole in the rules and exploiting it ruthlessly. But Cyniska's story gets weirder. As a royal daughter, she underwent the prostisti, same brutal training as other Spartan girls, just with better nutritional supplements. She spent her childhood learning to fight, hunt, and presumably intimidate foreign diplomats at state dinners. The irony? She became famous for a sport she never physically participated in a society that was obsessed with physical prowess. It's like becoming a professional gamer by hiring someone else to play for you. Technically impressive, but also deeply absurd. Her Olympic victories weren't just personal achievements. They were propaganda tools. Sparta used her wins to prove that even their women were superior to other cities' men. Imagine the trash talk: our girls' horses run faster than your boys. The psychological warfare was real and apparently effective. Modern parallels? It's like if a military academy's debate team won the national championship and the school used it to recruit more soldiers. This wasn't just about raising tough kids. This was about survival of the state itself. Spartan society was built on a foundation of controlled violence and manufactured scarcity. Every aspect of a girl's upbringing was designed to produce mothers who would send their sons off to war with a smile and their daughters into the same. Brutal system without hesitation. The famous phrase, "come back with your shield or on it," wasn't motivational speaking, it was a mother's literal expectation. Who was affected? Everyone. Spartan girls, obviously, but also the helots who raised them, the neighboring cities who had to deal with the results, and future generations who inherited this system. Why this mattered then? Military dominance in a world where weakness meant extinction. Why it matters now? It shows how societies can normalize extreme practices when they're presented as necessary for survival. The complexity we'll explore isn't just about ancient history. It's about how cultures justify putting children through systems that would qualify as abuse by any modern standard. But Siniska and her royal privilege was just the beginning of this story. The real nightmare was what happened to ordinary girls, the ones without palace connections or royal bloodlines. Their training made boot camp look like a spa retreat. The agoge, Sparta's educational system, wasn't just military school with extra push-ups. Unlike modern assumptions about ancient Greek women being confined to domestic spaces, Spartan girls got their own version of hell that was somehow both more and less sexist than you'd expect. While Athenian girls learned to be silent and invisible, Spartan girls learned to be loud, aggressive, and absolutely terrifying to anyone who wasn't also raised by wolves. This developed because Sparta had a unique problem. They needed women strong enough to survive childbirth in an era when that was basically Russian roulette, smart enough to manage estates while their husbands were off playing soldier for decades, and tough enough to raise the next generation of warriors without going completely insane. So they created a system that treated 7-year-old girls like Navy SEAL recruits, because apparently that made sense to someone. The historical context here is crucial. This wasn't some progressive experiment in gender equality. This was a society so paranoid about weakness that they applied military logic to literally everything, including raising children. The Spartans looked at the concept of a gentle childhood and said, "No thanks, we'll take psychological trauma and call it character building." They weren't trying to liberate women. They were trying to weaponize them. The training began at age 7, when girls were taken from their families and placed in communal groups called packs, because nothing says healthy child development like literally treating kids like wild animals. These weren't boarding schools with strict rules. These were institutions designed to strip away individual identity and rebuild it according to state specifications. Modern military boot camps borrowed heavily from this model, except they usually wait until recruits are adults and can theoretically consent to having their personalities demolished and reconstructed. Take the case of physical training, which makes modern gym class look like nap time. Spartan girls spent their days running, wrestling, throwing javelins, and competing in what can only be described as organized violence. But here's where it gets weird. They did most of this naked. Not because the Spartans were perverts, but because they believed exposure to the elements would toughen them up. Imagine explaining that to modern parents. "Sorry, Mrs. Johnson, but little Sophia needs to do her gymnastics routine in the nude because character development." The wrestling wasn't gentle grappling either. These girls were taught to fight like their lives depended on it, because in Sparta, they literally might. One account describes a training exercise where girls had to steal food from heavily guarded areas without getting caught. If they succeeded, they got to eat. If they failed, they got beaten and went hungry. It's like if Survivor was designed by people who thought Lord of the Flies wasn't intense enough. The famous festival of Artemis, Orthia, involved girls competing in endurance contests that bordered on torture. They would dance and perform acrobatics for hours while being whipped, with the winner being whoever lasted longest without crying out. The crowd would cheer like it was entertainment, which I guess it was, in the same way that gladiator fights were entertainment. One Spartan girl allegedly endured this for so long that she passed out and had to be carried away, but was declared the winner because she never made a sound. Modern parents freak out over participation trophies. Spartan. Parents literally applauded their daughters being whipped unconscious. The psychological conditioning was equally brutal. Girls were taught that showing weakness wasn't just shameful, it was a betrayal of their entire society. They learned songs that glorified death in battle and mocked cowardice with lyrics that would make a drill sergeant blush. Imagine kindergartners singing nursery rhymes about how disappointing it would be if they didn't die heroically for their country. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder if you'd rather come home on your shield or get stabbed with a spear. The group competitions were designed to create artificial scarcity and conflict. Girls were deliberately given insufficient food and supplies, then forced to compete for resources. This wasn't accidental cruelty, it was systematic conditioning to prepare them for a life where resources were always limited and competition was constant. Think Hunger Games, but with the added twist that the adults organizing it genuinely believed they were doing the kids a favor. One particularly charming tradition involved older girls mentoring younger ones through a system that was basically institutionalized hazing. The older girls would test the younger ones through increasingly difficult and humiliating challenges, supposedly to build character. The younger girls were expected to endure this with gratitude because their tormentors were preparing them for the real world. It's like if sorority initiation was designed by prison wardens and lasted for years instead of weeks. But it wasn't that simple, because nothing in Sparta ever was. The same society that put girls through this ordeal also gave them more legal rights than women anywhere else in Greece. Spartan women could own property, make business decisions, and speak their minds in public, freedoms that would have been scandalous in Athens. It's like if a military dictatorship also happened to be run by feminists, which is exactly as confusing as it sounds. The contradictions run deeper. These girls were trained to be physically and mentally tough, but they were also expected to be mothers and wives who would defer to male authority when it mattered. They learned to fight and compete, but their ultimate purpose was still defined by their relationships to men, as daughters, wives, and mothers of warriors. It's progressive and regressive at the same time, which is peak ancient world logic. Different perspectives on this system existed even within Sparta. Some families embraced the brutality as necessary for survival, while others quietly tried to shield their daughters from the worst excesses. Wealthy families could sometimes afford private tutors who might emphasize intellectual development alongside physical training, creating a two-tiered system that contradicted Sparta's supposed egalitarianism. The situation was more complex than simple abuse because results were mixed. Many Spartan women did become genuinely formidable, physically strong, mentally resilient, and capable of managing complex responsibilities. But others were traumatized, and we have hints in ancient sources that some never recovered from their childhood experiences. It's like extreme sports training. Some athletes thrive under intense pressure, while others develop anxiety disorders and chronic injuries. Modern analogies help explain the complexity. Imagine if elite military families sent their daughters to special forces training from childhood, but also gave them trust funds and voting rights. Progressive in some ways, horrifying in others, and definitely not something you'd want to explain to child. Protective services. The result was a generation of women who were unlike anything else in the ancient world. Spartan women became famous throughout Greece for their physical strength, sharp tongues, and complete lack of patience for male nonsense. Foreign visitors were simultaneously impressed and terrified by women who could probably beat them in physical combat while delivering cutting verbal takedowns. Who was affected? Obviously the girls themselves, but also their future husbands, who had to deal with wives who weren't intimidated by traditional male authority. Spartan marriages were notoriously stormy, partly because both partners had been trained to be competitive and aggressive. It's like if two alpha personalities got married after meeting at CrossFit. Lots of passion, lots of conflict, and probably some broken furniture. The institutional reactions were predictably contradictory. Spartan officials praised the system when it produced strong mothers and successful athletes, but quietly worried about women who became too independent or questioned state policies. There are records of women being punished for expressing political opinions, even though their education had taught them to think critically and speak boldly. Long-term implications included a society where gender roles were simultaneously more fluid and more rigid than anywhere else in Greece. Women had more practical power, but were still expected to channel it towards state-approved goals. The system created strong individuals while demanding absolute conformity, which is a psychological contradiction that probably explains why Spartan culture was so uniquely intense. Other Greek cities reacted with a mixture of admiration and horror. Athenian writers criticized Spartan women as unwomanly and dangerous, while secretly envying their physical capabilities and financial independence. The reputation of Spartan women became a recruiting tool men from other cities sometimes sought. Spartan wives specifically because of their strength and competence, while others avoided them for exactly the same reasons. Meanwhile, while girls were learning to endure whippings and wrestle each other into submission, Spartan society was developing an equally brutal system for determining who got to participate in this nightmare at all. Because apparently, putting children through military boot camp wasn't exclusive enough. First, you had to prove you were genetically worthy of the abuse. The selection process for who got to join the agoge wasn't based on merit or family connections, but on a system of genetic screening that makes modern college admissions look relaxed and inclusive. Spartan officials examined newborns like livestock, deciding who was strong enough to endure the training and who should be removed from consideration permanently. This created a whole different level of anxiety for parents who had to worry, not just about their children surviving the training, but about them being deemed worthy of it in the first place. And if you think the girls' training was intense, wait until you hear about the selection criteria and the psychological games the state played with families to maintain control over this entire system. The intersection of eugenics and education in Sparta created situations that were both absurdly bureaucratic and genuinely terrifying, often at the same time. If the agoge training was Sparta's version of extreme sports, then their selection process was like a twisted game show where the prize was getting to participate in child abuse, and losing meant your baby got thrown off a cliff, literally. While other Greek cities practiced the ancient equivalent of every child is special, Sparta took a hard look at that philosophy and said, actually no, most children are defective and we're going to do something about it. This system became important because Sparta faced a fundamental mathematical problem. They needed warriors, but they also needed those warriors to be absolutely perfect specimens of human physical and mental development. You can't have both quantity and quality when your educational system has a mortality rate that makes medieval medicine look safe. So they decided to solve this by implementing what was essentially a quality control program for babies. Because apparently someone looked at the concept of natural selection and thought, we can do this faster. The context here is crucial. This wasn't just about military efficiency. This was about resource allocation in a society where every calorie and every minute of training time was precious. The Spartans calculated that it was better to invest heavily in fewer, supposedly Superior children tend to spread resources across a larger population of potentially mediocre ones. It's like if a tech startup decided to hire only Nobel Prize winners instead of regular programmers. Except instead of just not hiring people, they actively eliminated the competition. The selection process developed into an elaborate bureaucracy of human evaluation that would make modern HR departments look laid back. Officials called the Gerousia literally Council of Old Men made life or death decisions about newborns based on criteria that mixed legitimate health concerns with superstitions that would embarrass a medieval peasant. They weren't just looking for healthy babies. They were looking for babies that fit their specific template of what a future warrior should look like, which included everything from muscle tone to the shape of their skulls. Consider the story of Demaratus. Though he was male, his case illustrates how the system worked for all Spartan children. Born to King Ariston, Demaratus should have been automatically accepted into the agoge. But court politics and questions about his parentage led to whisper campaigns about his fitness. The Gerousia subjected him to additional scrutiny that included examining his physical development, testing his pain tolerance, and even analyzing his facial features for signs of foreign influence. He eventually became king, but the process shows how even royal children weren't immune to the selection anxiety. For girls, the stakes were different but equally high. Take the case of a family recorded by Plutarch. The parents had twin daughters, but one was born with a slightly malformed hand. The Gerousia's decision process took 3 days, during which the family waited to learn whether one or both children would be accepted. The healthy twin was approved for the agoge, while her sister was taken to the apothete, the place of rejection, where unwanted infants were left to die. The parents were expected to accept this decision with gratitude, because the state had spared them the expense of raising a defective child. But here's where it gets really twisted. The selection process wasn't just about obvious physical defects. The examiners looked for personality traits in newborns that they believed predicted future warrior potential. They claimed they could identify courage, aggression, and intelligence in babies who were literally days old. One account describes examiners dropping infants from small heights to test their reflexes, exposing them to loud noises to measure their reactions, and even analyzing their crying patterns for signs of weakness. The psychological pressure on parents was immense. Mothers would spend their pregnancies following elaborate rituals designed to improve their children's chances of acceptance. They exercised obsessively, ate specific diets, and even listened to particular types of music, believing these activities would influence their unborn children's development. It's like if modern helicopter parenting started in the womb and was enforced by the threat of infanticide. One particularly disturbing case involved a family where the mother had already lost 2 children to the selection process. When her 3rd child was born, she attempted to hide a minor birthmark that she feared would lead to rejection. The deception was discovered, and she was punished not just for lying to the state, but for showing excessive maternal attachment that could interfere with her child's proper development. The child was rejected anyway, and the mother was banned from having more children. It's the ancient equivalent of being kicked out of a parenting group for caring too much about your kids. The bureaucracy around this process was staggering. Officials kept detailed records of which families produced acceptable children and which didn't. Families with multiple rejections were stigmatized and sometimes excluded from certain social activities. There were appeals processes, second opinions, and even cases where rejected children were later reconsidered if political circumstances changed. It's like if college admissions were literally life or death, administered by people who thought they could predict your entire future based on how you looked as a newborn. The selection process also included bizarre superstitions. Children born during certain lunar phases were automatically suspect. Babies who cried too much or too little were both problematic. Even the circumstances of birth mattered. Children born during military victories were favored, while those born during defeats faced extra scrutiny. One family allegedly delayed reporting their child's birth by several days, waiting for news from a military campaign because they believed it would improve their chances of acceptance. This wasn't an isolated Spartan quirk. It was part of a broader pattern of ancient societies trying to engineer human perfection through selective breeding and environmental control. But Sparta took this concept further than anyone else, creating a systematic approach to human quality control that combined legitimate health screening with pseudoscientific theories about genetic destiny. The pattern existed because Sparta faced unique pressures that other city-states didn't. Their economy depended on helot labor. Their military strategy required exceptional individual soldiers, and their social system couldn't tolerate the kind of diversity that might undermine group cohesion. They needed to produce specific types of people for specific roles, and they believed that starting the selection process at birth was more efficient than waiting to see how children develop naturally. Social and economic factors reinforced this system. Resources were genuinely limited. Every child accepted into the agoge represented a significant investment of food, training time, and social attention. Political factors mattered too. Having defective children in your family could damage your standing in a society where genetic fitness was tied to political authority. Military considerations were paramount. Commanders believed that armies were only as strong as their weakest members, so eliminating weak members before they joined the army seemed logical. Compared to other time periods, this was unusual even by ancient standards. Most societies practiced some form of infanticide, but usually for economic reasons during famines or crises. Sparta institutionalized it as a permanent policy based on theories about optimal human development. The Romans, who weren't squeamish about violence, were disturbed by Spartan selection practices. The Athenians, despite their own social problems, used Spartan infanticide as an example of why Sparta was barbaric and un-Greek. The pattern repeated in different forms. Throughout history, eugenics movements, selective breeding programs, and various attempts to create perfect societies through population control. But most of these later examples were implemented by modern states with industrial resources and scientific pretensions. Sparta achieved similar results using Bronze Age technology and sheer bureaucratic determination, which is somehow both impressive and horrifying. The effects were both exactly what Sparta intended and completely different from what they expected. On one hand, the system did produce physically impressive individuals who were genuinely tough and capable. Spartan women became famous throughout the ancient world for their strength and competence. And this reputation wasn't just propaganda. Visitors consistently reported being amazed by their physical capabilities and mental toughness. Who benefited? The children who passed selection and survived the training did gain genuine advantages. They were physically stronger, more mentally resilient, and better prepared for the harsh realities of ancient life than their counterparts in other cities. They also gained social status and political rights that were unusual for women in the ancient world. The state benefited by having a population that was genuinely exceptional in physical and mental terms. But who suffered? Obviously, the children who were rejected suffered the ultimate consequence. Their families suffered psychological trauma that rippled through generations. Even successful families lived with constant anxiety about whether their next child would be accepted. The entire society suffered from the psychological effects of normalizing infanticide and extreme child abuse as necessary social policies. Unintended consequences were significant. The selection process created a society that was physically strong but psychologically brittle. Spartans were notoriously bad at adapting to new situations or accepting change, partly because their entire culture was built around rigid adherence to established patterns. The system also created demographic problems by rejecting so many children. Sparta struggled with population decline that eventually contributed to their military and political collapse. How this shaped future developments is complex. Other societies studied Spartan methods and adopted modified versions for military training, but few attempted to replicate the selection process. The reputation of Spartan education influenced Greek and Roman thinking about child development, but usually as a cautionary tale rather than a model to follow. Modern parallels are uncomfortable but real. Any society that tries to engineer human perfection through systematic control of reproduction and child-rearing faces similar trade-offs between efficiency and humanity. The methods change, but the underlying logic that society can be improved by eliminating undesirable elements and optimizing the development of desirable ones keeps recurring in different forms throughout history. Yet even as Sparta was perfecting its system of genetic selection and brutal training, the girls who survived this process were approaching the next phase of their nightmare, adolescence. Because apparently, surviving infancy and childhood in Sparta was just the warm-up for the main event, becoming a teenager in a society that had very specific and very disturbing ideas about how young women should demonstrate their readiness for adult responsibilities. The transition from child to adult in Sparta wasn't marked by sweet 16 parties or graduation ceremonies. Instead, it involved public competitions that were part athletic contest, part beauty pageant, and part psychological evaluation, all designed to determine which girls were ready to become mothers of the next generation of warriors. These events combined Sparta's obsession with physical perfection with their practical need to identify which young women were most likely to survive childbirth and produce healthy offspring. If you thought the childhood training was intense, the adolescent rituals took everything up another level. These weren't coming-of-age ceremonies designed to celebrate young people's transition to adulthood. They were elaborate testing procedures designed to weed out anyone who couldn't handle the full responsibility of Spartan citizenship. And the stakes couldn't have been higher, because failure didn't just mean social embarrassment or delayed adulthood. It could mean permanent exclusion from the core of Spartan society. By age 14, Spartan girls faced what can only be described as the ultimate final exam. Except, instead of getting a bad grade, failure meant social exile. And instead of studying textbooks, they'd been preparing through a decade of systematic physical and psychological conditioning that would make a Navy SEAL trainer say, maybe we should dial it back a little. The Gymnopedia festival had reached its crescendo, and every teenage girl in Sparta was about to find out whether years of brutal training had been worth it, or whether they'd be spending the rest of their lives as second-class citizens in their own homeland. The tensions were incredible. Parents who had invested everything in their daughter's success watched from the sidelines, knowing that one stumble, one moment of weakness, one wrong answer to a judge's question could destroy their family's social standing for generations. The girls themselves carried the weight of not just their own futures, but their family's honor, their bloodline's continuation, and the state's expectations for the next generation of warrior mothers. Key players included BFORs, basically Sparta's board of directors. If corporate boards had the power to ruin your life based on how well you performed gymnastics while being interrogated about military strategy, the Gerousia provided oversight, while groups of older Spartan women served as both mentors and judges. But the real pressure came from the other girls, because this wasn't just individual testing. It was direct competition, where someone else's success could mean your failure. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Success meant full citizenship, marriage prospects, property rights, and the chance to raise the next generation of Spartans. Failure meant becoming a moth-axe, essentially a second-class citizen, who could never fully participate in Spartan society. It's like if your high school graduation ceremony determined not just whether you got a diploma, but whether you'd be allowed to vote, own property, or have children for the rest of your life. The festival of Artemis Orthia in 420 BCE provides U.S. with the most detailed account of these trials, thanks to a visiting Athenian diplomat who was apparently so horrified by what he witnessed that he wrote it down in excruciating detail, probably as evidence that Spartans had completely lost their minds. The festival began at dawn with hundreds of teenage girls assembling in the sacred grove, naked, except for thin bronze bands around their waists that served as both symbolic protection and convenient handles for the judges to grab them during various tests. The morning started with what the Spartans called harmonic movement, essentially synchronized gymnastics performed while singing military songs. But this wasn't your typical school performance. The routines included combat moves, weapon handling, and acrobatic sequences that would challenge modern Olympic athletes. Cleo, daughter of a prominent military family, had trained for this moment her entire life. As she moved through the opening sequence, a combination of dance, wrestling, and spear throwing, spectators could see years of brutal conditioning in every movement. But the judges weren't just watching her physical performance. They were evaluating her mental state, looking for signs of fear, hesitation, or what they called inappropriate softness. The afternoon brought the endurance trials, where girls were subjected to increasingly painful tests while being questioned about military strategy, Spartan law, and their readiness to sacrifice everything for the state. Cleo found herself hanging from wooden posts while judges struck her legs with thin reeds, demanding that she recite the names of famous Spartan battles while maintaining perfect composure. Other girls around her were failing, crying out, giving incorrect answers, or simply collapsing from the combination of physical pain and psychological pressure. But the real drama came during what witnesses called the revelation trials. Each girl was presented with hypothetical scenarios designed to test her commitment to Spartan values. Cleo was asked, "Your husband returns from battle wounded and unable to fight. Your son is 7 years old. Food is scarce. What do you do?" The correct answer, which she gave without hesitation, was that she would ensure her son received adequate nutrition to continue his training, while her wounded husband would receive only what was necessary for basic survival, because the future warrior was more valuable to the state than the damaged one. The psychological manipulation was extraordinary. Judges deliberately created no-win scenarios to see how girls would react under pressure. One test involved presenting girls with a crying infant, borrowed for the occasion, and asking them to demonstrate how they would respond if the child showed signs of weakness. Several girls failed this test by showing what judges deemed excessive maternal instinct, basically being too gentle with a baby. The climax came during the final individual evaluations, where each girl faced a panel of 5 judges alone. Cleo's questioning lasted nearly an hour and covered everything from her family history to her opinions on recent military campaigns. But the most dramatic moment came when they asked her to demonstrate her commitment to Spartan values by criticizing something about her own family. Without hesitation, she stated that her younger brother had shown concerning signs of sentiment during his early training and might need additional conditioning to overcome his weakness. The judges' reactions were immediate and decisive. Some girls were approved on the spot, receiving the bronze armbands that marked them as full Spartan citizens. Others were dismissed with varying degrees of shame and social exile. But a significant number, including several who had performed well in the physical trials, were placed in a middle category that required additional evaluation. The unexpected development came when one girl, Penthesilea, challenged a judge's decision. She had been rejected for showing insufficient aggression, during a combat demonstration, but she argued that she had been demonstrating tactical restraint rather than weakness. This created a crisis because the testing protocol didn't include provisions for appeals, but her argument was logically sound according to Spartan military doctrine. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Other girls began questioning their own evaluations. Parents started arguing with officials, and the entire ceremony devolved into what one witness described as a marketplace brawl with philosophical pretensions. The F-Wars had to suspend the proceedings and reconvene the next day with additional protocols for handling disputes. The response was swift and revealed the psychological fault lines running through Spartan society. The successful girls, now recognized as full citizens, immediately began displaying the arrogance and competitiveness they'd been trained to embrace. They formed exclusive groups, looked down on the failures, and started planning their future roles as warrior mothers with an enthusiasm that disturbed even some Spartan adults. The immediate consequences for the failed candidates were devastating. They were relegated to Mothak status, which meant they could marry and have children, but their offspring would face additional scrutiny in the selection process. Their families lost social standing, their marriage prospects diminished, and they essentially became second-class citizens in their own homeland. Some families quietly sent their rejected daughters to live with relatives in other cities, essentially accepting exile rather than daily humiliation. Political fallout was significant because the testing had revealed uncomfortable truths about the system. The fact that girls could present logical arguments against judges. Decisions suggested that the education system was working too well. It was producing critical thinkers who might question state authority. Conservative factions argued for stricter protocols that would eliminate such challenges, while others worried that being too rigid would eliminate potentially valuable citizens. How this changed everything, or nothing, depends on your perspective. The testing procedures were modified to include clearer appeals processes, but the fundamental brutality remained unchanged. The psychological impact on families was immense, creating a generation of parents who lived in constant fear of their children's evaluations, while simultaneously pushing them toward the very system that might destroy them. The ironic outcomes were numerous. Some girls who failed the official tests went on to become influential in other Greek cities, where their Spartan training made them exceptionally capable leaders and businesswomen. Meanwhile, some who passed the tests struggled with the psychological aftermath of the brutal competition, developing what we'd now recognize as anxiety disorders and trust issues that affected their ability to form healthy relationships. Perhaps most ironically, the very success of the system created new problems. The girls who passed became so competitive and aggressive that they often had difficulty cooperating with each other as adults. Spartan women were famous for their fierce independence, but this sometimes translated into an inability to work together effectively, which undermined some of the collective goals the training was supposed to achieve. This festival wasn't just a coming-of-age ceremony. It was a microcosm of everything that was both impressive and terrifying about Spartan society. On the surface, it demonstrated the state's commitment to excellence and its willingness to make hard decisions about resource allocation. The girls who succeeded were genuinely exceptional by any measure, physically capable, mentally tough, and absolutely committed to their society's values. But the deeper meaning revealed the psychological costs of perfection. The system created individuals who were incredibly capable, but also deeply damaged by the process that made them capable. The festivals demonstrated that Sparta could produce superhuman results, but only by treating humans as raw material to be processed, rather than as individuals with inherent worth. What it revealed about the system was that Sparta had created a machine for manufacturing a specific type of person, but had lost sight of whether that type of person was actually what society needed. The girls who emerged from this process were perfectly adapted to Spartan society, but poorly equipped to handle any situation that didn't conform to Spartan expectations. Long-term effects included a society where excellence came at the cost of flexibility, where strength was built on a foundation of trauma, and where success required the acceptance of cruelty as normal and necessary. The festivals created generations of women who were individually impressive, but collectively unable to adapt. When their perfect system encountered problems, it wasn't designed to handle. Why historians still debate. It comes down to a fundamental question. Is it possible to create exceptional people without destroying their humanity in the process? The Spartan festivals suggest that the answer might be no, that there are inherent trade-offs between individual excellence and individual well-being that no society has successfully resolved. Modern military training, elite athletics, and academic competition programs all face similar dilemmas, but few have pushed the boundaries as far as ancient Sparta did. Around the brutal festivals and testing systems, a fascinating cast of supporting characters played crucial roles in maintaining this nightmare machinery. Let's be clear, these weren't villains twirling their mustaches and cackling about child abuse. They were ordinary people who had internalized extraordinary cruelty as normal, which is somehow more disturbing than cartoonish evil. Meet Lysander the Judge, a member of the Gerousia who spent 30 years evaluating teenage girls for citizenship worthiness. His day job involved determining which children deserved basic human rights based on their athletic performance and willingness to embrace psychopathic value systems. Lysander genuinely believed he was performing a sacred duty, protecting Sparta from weakness by weeding out inadequate specimens. His personal notes, discovered centuries later, reveal a man who tracked his success rate like a modern HR manager, proudly noting that girls he approved went on to produce an above-average number of successful warriors. He kept detailed records of physical measurements, pain tolerance levels, and what he called appropriate responses to moral dilemmas, basically a database of how well children had learned to suppress their natural empathy. But here's the twisted part. Lysander was considered progressive because he sometimes gave second chances to girls who showed improvement between evaluations. His contemporaries thought he was too soft, while modern readers would probably want to have him arrested. He represents the banality of evil, not a monster, just a bureaucrat who happened to bureaucratize child abuse. Then there's Gorgo the trainer, one of the older women responsible for preparing girls for their trials. Gorgo had survived the system herself, and now dedicated her life to putting others through the same trauma, convinced that she was helping them achieve their potential. She developed innovative torture techniques disguised as training methods, including psychological games that would make military interrogators proud. Her specialty was breaking down girls' individual personalities and rebuilding them according to state specifications. Gorgo's story shows the cycle of abuse that kept the system functioning. She genuinely cared about her trainees in her own warped way, celebrating their successes and mourning their failures. But her definition of success included things like learn to hide emotional responses effectively and demonstrated proper indifference to others' suffering. She was simultaneously nurturing and destructive, which perfectly captures the psychological confusion at the heart of Spartan society. Perhaps most tragic was Helena the mother, whose 3 daughters went through the testing process with dramatically different results. Her eldest passed with honors and became a model Spartan citizen. Her middle daughter failed spectacularly and was exiled to live with distant relatives. Her youngest was killed during training when a character-building exercise went too far. Helena's response to these outcomes reveals the psychological contortions required to function in Spartan society. She publicly celebrated her successful daughter, showed no emotion about her failed daughter, and praised the state for sparing her youngest from a life of inadequacy. But private letters suggest she was quietly going insane from grief and cognitive dissonance. She represents the thousands of parents who supported a system that destroyed their own children because the alternative was admitting that their entire society was built on institutionalized child abuse. The most complex figure might be Alcibiades the skeptic, a minor official who began questioning the system after witnessing too many promising children fail for arbitrary reasons. He couldn't openly criticize the festivals without risking his own position. So he developed subtle ways to help girls prepare for the psychological aspects of the testing. He created unofficial study groups where girls could practice answering moral dilemmas and learn to hide their natural emotional responses. Alcibiades represents the people who knew the system was wrong but felt powerless to change it. His quiet resistance probably saved some girls from failure, but it also helped perpetuate the system by making it slightly more bearable. He's a reminder that most historical atrocities aren't maintained by zealots alone. They also require the participation of people who know better but lack the courage to act decisively. These weren't isolated incidents scattered across decades. They were part of an intricate web of relationships and consequences that shows how deeply embedded the brutality was in everyday Spartan life. The connections between these stories reveal a society where every family, every friendship, and every professional relationship was shaped by the shared trauma of the education system. Take the relationship between Lysander the judge and Helena the mother. Her eldest daughter's success in the trials wasn't just a family triumph. It was a professional validation for Lysander, who had identified her as promising during early evaluations. He took personal pride in her achievements and used her as an example when training other judges. Meanwhile, Helena felt obligated to express gratitude to Lysander for recognizing her daughter's worth, even though the same system had destroyed her other children. This created a toxic dynamic where victims thanked their abusers and abusers felt justified by their victims' gratitude. It's like Stockholm Syndrome scaled up to an entire society. The successful families became invested in defending the system that had validated them, while the failed families were too ashamed to speak out against it. The web gets more complex. When you consider Gorgo the trainer's relationship with both judges and families, she served as an intermediary, helping families understand what the judges wanted while helping judges identify which girls had the best training. But she also had her own agenda, proving that her training methods were superior to those of other trainers. This created a competitive market in child abuse, where trainers vied to produce the most successfully indoctrinated students. Political networks played a crucial role in maintaining the system. Successful families formed alliances based on their shared experience of surviving the trials, while failed families were systematically excluded from these networks. This created a self-reinforcing cycle, where the people with the most influence were also the most invested in defending the system, while the people who might have criticized it were marginalized. How one event led to another becomes clear when you track specific families across generations. Helena's successful daughter went on to marry into another prominent family, strengthening the political alliance between two groups that supported the current system. Her failed daughter's exile removed a potential critic from Spartan society. Her dead daughter became a cautionary tale used to justify even stricter safety protocols, which actually made the training more psychologically brutal while making it appear more caring. The unintended consequences of these interconnected relationships were significant. The system created a society where personal relationships were constantly contaminated by political considerations. Friendships between mothers depended partly on their children's relative success in the trials. Marriages were arranged based not just on individual compatibility, but on families' track records in producing acceptable children. Perhaps most perversely, The system created a culture where people competed to demonstrate their loyalty by being even more brutal than required. Trainers developed increasingly harsh methods to prove their dedication. Parents pushed their children harder to show their commitment to state values. Judges became more demanding to demonstrate their standards. It's like a workplace where everyone tries to prove their dedication by working longer hours. Except instead of burnout, the result was systematic child abuse. The webs of relationships also meant that criticism of the system became virtually impossible. Any parent who questioned the trials was implicitly criticizing the choices of every other parent who had supported them. Any official who suggested reforms was attacking the competence of every other official who had administered the current system. The social cost of dissent was so high that most people found it easier to rationalize the brutality than to confront it. To understand how a society could normalize this level of systematic cruelty toward its own children, you have to understand that Spartans lived in a state of constant existential anxiety that made extreme measures seem reasonable. Daily life in Sparta was shaped by the knowledge that they were vastly outnumbered by their helot slaves, surrounded by hostile neighbors, and dependent on a military system that required absolute perfection to function effectively. Beliefs and attitudes were shaped by a worldview that saw life as a zero-sum competition where weakness meant death, not just for individuals, but for the entire society. Spartans genuinely believed that showing mercy to their own children was a form of cruelty because it would leave them unprepared for a world that would show them no mercy. This wasn't sadism, it was a twisted form of love, which makes it even more disturbing. Social structures reinforced these beliefs at every level. The helot system meant that Spartans were constantly surrounded by people who had every reason to hate them and would kill them if given the opportunity. This created a siege mentality, where anything that might weaken Spartan military capability was seen as an existential threat. In this context, treating children gently wasn't just soft-hearted. It was potentially treasonous. What was normal versus exceptional becomes clear when you compare Spartan practices to those of their neighbors. Other Greek cities practiced infanticide, but usually only during crises. Other societies had harsh educational systems, but usually only for elite males. Sparta was exceptional in applying systematic brutality to all children of both genders as a permanent policy. But they were normal in wanting to produce physically and mentally capable citizens. How this shaped events is crucial to understanding why the system persisted for centuries. The cultural context made it almost impossible for individuals to question practices that might seem obviously abusive to outsiders. When your entire society is organized around the principle that survival requires perfection, and perfection requires brutality, then brutality becomes a moral imperative rather than a moral failing. The most disturbing aspect of the cultural context was how it created a feedback loop that reinforced itself. The system produced individuals who were genuinely capable and impressive, which seemed to validate the methods used to create them. When Spartan women consistently outperformed women from other cities in physical and mental challenges, it appeared to prove that the brutal training was not only justified but necessary. Modern parallels to this cultural dynamic can be found in any high-pressure environment where extreme methods are justified by exceptional results. Elite military units, competitive athletics, academic pressure cookers, and corporate cultures that normalize overwork and stress. The question isn't whether these environments produce results. They often do. But whether the human cost is justified by the benefits. Perhaps most ironic was how a system designed to eliminate weakness actually created new forms of weakness that were more dangerous than the ones it was supposed to prevent. The Spartan obsession with physical and mental toughness produced a society that was psychologically brittle and incapable of adapting to change. They created individuals who could endure incredible physical hardship, but who completely fell apart. when faced with situations that didn't fit their training. Examples of contradictions abound throughout the system. The same society that prided itself on producing strong, independent women also required those women to submit completely to state authority. The training that was supposed to eliminate selfish individualism actually created people who were intensely competitive and often unable to cooperate effectively. The festivals designed to identify the best candidates for citizenship often eliminated people whose independent thinking and moral reasoning made them potentially more valuable to society than the conformists who passed. How things weren't what they seemed becomes clear when you look at the long-term outcomes. Many of the girls who failed the Spartan trials went on to lead successful, fulfilling lives in other cities, while some who succeeded struggled with the psychological aftermath of their brutal conditioning. The system that claimed to identify natural superiority often ignored actual talent in favor of obedience and conformity. Modern parallels to these contradictions are everywhere. Any institution that claims to develop human potential through extreme pressure faces similar trade-offs between effectiveness and humanity. Military academies that break down recruits to build them up stronger often produce capable soldiers who struggle with civilian life. Academic programs that push students to their limits sometimes create brilliant scholars who can't function outside highly structured environments. The most unsettling parallel might be how societies continue to rationalize extreme measures by pointing to exceptional results, while ignoring the human cost and the selection bias involved. Just as Sparta pointed to their successful graduates while ignoring their failures and casualties, modern institutions often measure success only among survivors, making brutal systems appear more effective than they actually are. Melanippe was 7 years old when the trainers first noticed her problem. She smiled too, frequently, and seemed genuinely happy during physical conditioning that was supposed to be building character through suffering. While other girls grimaced appropriately during endurance trials, Melanippe would grin as if she were playing games rather than undergoing serious military preparation. Her trainers were baffled and slightly horrified by a child who appeared to enjoy activities that were specifically designed to be unpleasant. The solution, naturally, was to make her training more unpleasant until she achieved the proper level of misery. Melanippe was assigned additional conditioning exercises, longer periods of food restriction, and psychological pressure designed to eliminate what officials called her inappropriate cheerfulness. But the more they tried to break her spirit, the more determined she seemed to find joy in small things. A bird singing during morning drills, a particularly beautiful sunset during evening exercises, or the satisfaction of completing a difficult physical challenge. Her case became a matter of official concern when she reached age 12 and was still displaying what trainers described as dangerous optimism. Officials worried that her attitude might be contagious, potentially undermining the psychological conditioning of other girls in her cohort. They considered various interventions, including isolation training and assignment to more brutal instructors, but nothing seemed to dim her natural cheerfulness. The irony was that Melanippe was physically superior to most of her peers and intellectually sharp enough to excel in strategic exercises. By any objective measure, she was exactly the kind of citizen Sparta wanted to produce. But her emotional resilience, the ability to maintain psychological well-being under adverse conditions, was interpreted as a character flaw rather than a strength. She eventually passed her citizenship trials, but only after learning to hide her natural disposition behind a mask of appropriate grimness that satisfied her evaluators. Thessaly represented everything the Spartan educational system was designed to produce: physically powerful, mentally disciplined, emotionally controlled, and absolutely committed to state values. From her earliest training, she excelled at every challenge, endured every hardship without complaint, and demonstrated the kind of unthinking obedience that made trainers weep with pride. She was held up as an example to other girls, featured in official propaganda, and destined for an important marriage that would strengthen political alliances between prominent families. But Thessaly's perfection came at a cost that wasn't apparent until she reached adulthood. The conditioning that made her an ideal Spartan citizen also made her incapable of functioning in situations that weren't rigidly structured according to familiar patterns. When faced with unexpected challenges or required to make independent decisions, she would freeze, waiting for orders that might not come. Her husband eventually complained that living with her was like being married to a beautifully crafted automaton that could perform perfectly within specific parameters, but had no capacity for spontaneous thought or emotion. The tragic element of Thessaly's story is that her success was actually a form of psychological damage that the system was designed to produce. She had internalized Spartan values so completely that she had no individual identity separate from her role as a state-produced citizen. When other women began questioning traditional practices or adapting to changing circumstances, Thessaly couldn't understand their behavior because flexibility hadn't been part of her programming. Her case illustrates how institutional success and individual well-being can be completely disconnected. By official standards, Thessaly was the ideal product of Spartan education, but by any measure of human flourishing, she was a casualty of a system that prioritized conformity over development, obedience over wisdom, and institutional needs over personal growth. Penthesilea earned her nickname by becoming legendary for her ability to slip away from supervised activities and disappear into the countryside for hours at a time, only to return with detailed knowledge of local geography, wildlife, patterns, and tactical opportunities that impressed even her most demanding instructors. Her escapes weren't acts of rebellion. They were motivated by intellectual curiosity and a need for solitude that the intensely communal Spartan system couldn't accommodate. The officials didn't know what to do with her. On one hand, her independent exploration demonstrated exactly the kind of initiative and resourcefulness they wanted to encourage in future military leaders. Her informal intelligence gathering had actually provided valuable information about potential invasion routes and defensive positions that official scouts had missed. On the other hand, her willingness to ignore direct orders and pursue her own agenda represented a dangerous precedent that could undermine the entire system if other girls started following her. Example. Their solution was typically Spartan in its complexity. They simultaneously punished her for disobedience while secretly encouraging her unconventional skills. She received official discipline for unauthorized absences, but she also received unofficial mentoring from instructors who recognized her tactical talents. This double standard created a psychological environment where she never knew whether her natural abilities were assets or liabilities, depending on the political climate and her evaluators' moods. Penthesilea's story reveals the fundamental contradictions in a system that claimed to value individual excellence while demanding absolute conformity. She eventually became a successful military strategist, but only after years of learning to navigate institutional hypocrisy that had celebrated her results while condemning her methods. Alcestis had the unfortunate habit of asking logical questions about policies that were supposed to be accepted without analysis. During lessons about Spartan superiority, she would ask for specific evidence. During training exercises designed to build character through hardship, she would inquire about the scientific basis for believing that suffering produced improvement. During citizenship preparation sessions, she would request clarification about the reasoning behind various laws and customs. Her questions weren't motivated by disrespect. She genuinely wanted to understand the system she was being prepared to serve. The problem was that many Spartan practices couldn't withstand logical scrutiny, and Alcestis's questions often revealed inconsistencies contradictions and arbitrary elements that officials preferred to keep hidden behind the veil of tradition and authority. Her instructors found themselves in the awkward position of either providing honest answers that undermined state ideology or giving evasive responses that made them appear ignorant or dishonest. The institutional response was to label her questioning as a form of intellectual arrogance that needed to be corrected through additional discipline and psychological conditioning. She was subjected to training designed to eliminate what officials called her excessive curiosity and replace it with appropriate deference to established wisdom. The irony was that other aspects of her education encouraged critical thinking and strategic analysis, creating mixed messages that left her confused about when questioning was appropriate versus when it was dangerous. Alcestis eventually learned to keep her questions to herself and provide the responses her evaluators wanted to hear. But the process of suppressing her natural intellectual curiosity damaged her ability to think creatively about genuine problems. She passed her trials by becoming a master of telling people what they wanted to hear rather than what they needed to know, which made her successful within the system while undermining the system's stated goals of producing wise and capable citizens. Everything changed when Sparta encountered something their brutal education system hadn't prepared them for: a world that no longer rewarded pure physical toughness and blind obedience. The turning point came during the Peloponnesian War's later stages, around 410 BCE, when Spartan society discovered that their perfectly conditioned warriors were losing battles, not because they weren't tough enough, but because they couldn't adapt to new military technologies and tactics that required creativity, innovation, and independent thinking. Exactly the qualities their education system had systematically eliminated. The background to this change was decades of military success that had convinced the Spartans their system was infallible. They had dominated Greek warfare for generations by producing soldiers who were physically superior and absolutely obedient to orders. But warfare was evolving, and their enemies were learning to exploit Spartan weaknesses that the Spartans themselves didn't even recognize they had. Why this moment was different was that it represented the first time Spartan superiority was challenged not by stronger enemies, but by smarter ones. The Athenians, who Spartans had always dismissed as weak and effeminate, were winning battles through naval tactics, siege warfare, and diplomatic strategies that required exactly the kind of flexible thinking that Spartan education crushed out of people. It's like if a heavyweight boxing champion kept losing fights to opponents who kept changing the rules from boxing to chess in the middle of the match. Key factors that led to transformation included military defeats that couldn't be explained away as flukes or bad luck. When Spartan armies started losing to forces they should have dominated, it created cognitive dissonance that even the most indoctrinated citizens couldn't ignore. More importantly, these defeats were often caused by Spartan commanders' inability to adapt their tactics when faced with unexpected situations. The crisis deepened when reports came back from defeated Spartan units describing scenarios their training had never covered. Spartan warriors, who had been conditioned to fight in specific formations using specific tactics, were completely helpless when enemies refused to engage according to traditional rules. They were like professional tennis players who were excellent at tennis, but had no idea what to do when someone handed them a basketball and pointed to a different court entirely. But the real shock came when Spartan women, the products of their supposedly superior education system, began questioning whether their daughters should continue to endure the traditional training if it was producing obsolete skills. Mothers who had survived the brutal festivals themselves started wondering whether putting their children through the same trauma was preparing them for success or programming them for failure in a changing world. The psychological impact on Spartan society was devastating. Their entire identity was built around the belief that their education system produced superior human beings. When that system started producing inferior results, it challenged every assumption they had about themselves, their society, and their place in the world. How change unfolded in Sparta was like watching a controlled demolition in slow motion. Except nobody was in control, and the people inside the building kept insisting everything was fine, even as the walls collapsed around them. The transformation didn't happen overnight because Spartan culture was specifically designed to resist change, viewing adaptation as weakness and innovation as dangerous deviation from proven methods. Resistance to change was immediate and predictable. Conservative Spartans argued that recent defeats were caused by insufficient adherence to traditional methods rather than problems with the methods themselves. They demanded stricter training, harsher selection criteria, and more brutal conditioning, convinced that the solution to every problem was more of the same approach that had created the problem. It's like trying to fix a computer virus by hitting the monitor harder, satisfying in the moment, but unlikely to address the actual issue. The champions of change came from unexpected sources. Ironically, some of the most effective advocates for reform were women who had excelled in the traditional system but recognized its limitations when applied to their own daughters. These mothers had survived the brutal training and achieved success by Spartan standards, but they could see that the world their daughters would inhabit required different skills than the ones they had learned. One key reformer was Kiniska, a royal princess who had won Olympic chariot races and was therefore beyond criticism by traditional standards. She began quietly suggesting that girls' education should include more intellectual development alongside physical training. Her arguments were carefully crafted to appeal to Spartan values. She claimed that smarter mothers would raise smarter warriors, and that intellectual flexibility was a form of strength rather than weakness. The specific steps of transformation were gradual and often disguised as improvements to the existing system rather than fundamental changes. Reformers introduced new subjects into the curriculum by framing them as advanced military training. Logic and rhetoric were taught as interrogation resistance, while basic mathematics was presented as resource allocation for military campaigns. It was like sneaking vegetables into a child's diet by hiding them in dessert. Obstacles encountered were both practical and philosophical. The traditional training infrastructure was designed around specific assumptions about what skills were important. The trainers themselves were products of the old system and often couldn't teach skills they had never learned. More fundamentally, many Spartans genuinely believed that intellectual development would weaken their children's physical and moral capabilities. Breakthrough moments came when reform training methods produced demonstrably better results in real-world situations. Girls who had received the modified education proved more effective at managing complex household responsibilities, showed better judgment in crisis situations, and, most importantly for Spartan values, produced children who were both physically capable and mentally adaptable. The role of individuals versus larger forces created interesting tensions throughout the process. Individual reformers provided leadership and vision, but the changes only took hold because larger historical forces made them necessary. The transformation wasn't driven by philosophical enlightenment about human rights or child welfare. It was driven by practical necessity as Sparta faced military and economic challenges that their traditional system couldn't address. Perhaps most tellingly, the reforms were often implemented by the same people who had administered the original brutal system. Trainers who had spent decades breaking down children's personalities to rebuild them according to rigid specifications now had to learn how to encourage creativity and independent thinking. It's like asking prison guards to suddenly become life coaches. Theoretically possible, but requiring a complete psychological reorientation that many people couldn't manage. The process revealed fundamental contradictions in Spartan values that had been hidden by centuries of military success. When forced to choose between maintaining traditional methods and achieving practical results, many Spartans discovered they cared more about results than traditions. This was shocking to a society that had defined itself through its unwavering commitment to ancient practices. Regardless of their effectiveness, resistance movements developed among traditionalists who saw any modification of the classical system as betrayal of everything Sparta represented. These groups sometimes sabotaged reform efforts, refused to send their daughters to modified training programs, and created alternative educational tracks that maintained the original brutality. The result was a fractured society, where different families were preparing their children for completely different versions of adulthood. The new educational system that emerged from this chaos was simultaneously more humane and more strategically effective than its predecessor. But it was also profoundly confusing to a society that had spent centuries believing that brutality and effectiveness were synonymous. The reformed Sparta of the late 5th century BCE looked like the old Sparta from the outside, but functioned according to completely different principles. How things were different became apparent in the daily routines of girls' education. Physical training remained intense, but it was supplemented with intellectual challenges that required creativity and problem-solving. Girls still learned to endure pain and hardship, but they also learned to think critically about when such endurance was strategically valuable versus when it was counterproductive. The festivals continued, but evaluation criteria expanded beyond pure physical performance and unthinking obedience. Who won and who lost in this transformation reveals the complexity of social change. Obviously, the girls who no longer faced the most extreme forms of abuse were winners, but some families who had invested everything in mastering the traditional system found their expertise suddenly obsolete. Trainers who specialized in psychological conditioning had to retrain themselves or become irrelevant, while those who could adapt their methods thrived in the new environment. New rules and norms emerged that tried to balance Spartan values with practical necessity. Courage was still prized, but it was redefined to include intellectual bravery and moral independence rather than just physical fearlessness. Obedience remained important, but it was tempered with expectations that citizens would think critically about orders and suggest improvements when appropriate. What stayed the same versus what changed dramatically illustrates how societies can maintain their core identity while fundamentally altering their practices. Spartans still believed in excellence, competition, and service to the state. They still valued physical fitness, mental toughness, and willingness to sacrifice for the greater good. But their methods for developing these qualities became more sophisticated and less traumatic. The most significant change was in how Spartans thought about human potential. The old system assumed that excellence could only be achieved by breaking people down and rebuilding them according to predetermined specifications. The new system recognized that different individuals might achieve excellence through different paths, and that diversity of approaches could strengthen rather than weaken the community. Unintended consequences of the reforms included a generation of young women who were more capable than their predecessors, but also more questioning of authority. These girls had been taught to think critically as part of their education, and they inevitably began applying that critical thinking to the society that had created them. This created new tensions as Spartan leaders found themselves dealing with citizens who were both more effective and more independent than previous generations. The psychological impact on families was complex. Parents who had suffered through the traditional system sometimes felt that their own trauma had been invalidated by the reforms, while others felt relieved that their children would be spared similar experiences. The result was generational tension that reflected broader questions about whether traditional Spartan values could survive in modified form. Was this change positive or negative? The answer depends entirely on what you value and what time frame you're considering. In the short term, the reforms clearly made Spartan society more effective at dealing with the practical challenges it faced. The new generation of women was better equipped to manage complex responsibilities and adapt to changing circumstances, which benefited both individual families and the state as a whole. Different perspectives on the transformation reflected deeper philosophical divisions about human nature and social organization. Traditionalists argued that the reforms had weakened Spartan character by introducing softness and complexity into a system that had succeeded through simplicity and harshness. They worried that citizens who learned to question and adapt might also learn to disobey and abandon their responsibilities when things got difficult. Reformers countered that the old system had created artificial strength that collapsed when tested by real-world complexity. They argued that true strength came from intelligence and adaptability rather than blind obedience and pain tolerance. From their perspective, the reforms didn't weaken Spartan values, but fulfilled them more effectively by producing citizens who were actually superior rather than just conditioned to appear superior. Short-term versus long-term effects created additional complications in evaluating the changes. The immediate benefits were clear. Fewer children died or were psychologically destroyed during training, and graduates were more capable of handling diverse challenges. But some critics worried that these improvements came at the cost of the intense group cohesion and shared identity that had made Spartan society uniquely effective for centuries. Unintended consequences included the eventual transformation of Sparta from a military state into something more like a normal Greek city. The educational reforms were part of a broader process that made Spartans more like their neighbors, which arguably made them more civilized, but also eliminated the unique characteristics that had made them historically significant. Modern judgment versus contemporary views creates interesting tensions in how we evaluate these changes. By contemporary standards, any move away from systematic child abuse was obviously positive. But by the standards of ancient warfare and survival, the question becomes more complicated. Did the reforms make Spartans better people at the cost of making them less effective warriors? The answer probably depends on whether you think being an effective warrior in the ancient world was worth the human cost required to achieve it. In the years and decades that followed the educational reforms, Sparta discovered that changing a system designed to resist change was like trying to perform surgery on yourself while blindfolded. Technically possible, but likely to create as many new problems as it solved. The reformed education system produced a generation of young women who were undeniably more capable than their predecessors, but also fundamentally different in ways that created unexpected tensions throughout Spartan society. New challenges emerged almost immediately as the reformed system began producing graduates. These young women were physically strong like their predecessors, but they were also intellectually curious, strategically minded, and, most problematically for traditional Spartan leaders, inclined to ask why when given orders rather than simply obeying without question. It's like if a military academy decided to encourage creative thinking and then acted surprised when their graduates started suggesting improvements to military doctrine. The evolution of the situation proved more complex than anyone had anticipated. The reformed education created women who were better at managing households, raising children, and contributing to political discussions, but it also created women who expected to be consulted on major decisions rather than simply informed of them after the fact. Spartan men who had been raised in the traditional system often found themselves married to women who were both more capable and more demanding than the wives they had expected. Second-generation effects became apparent as the children of reformed women entered the education system themselves. These children had been raised by mothers who encouraged questioning and critical thinking, which created a fundamental mismatch with an educational system that still relied heavily on obedience and conformity, even in its modified form. The result was a generation of children who were simultaneously better prepared for intellectual challenges and less willing to accept authority without justification. Perhaps most significantly, the reforms created a feedback loop that accelerated further changes. Each generation of women educated under the new system became advocates for additional modifications, arguing that if some intellectual development was beneficial, more would be even better. Conservative Spartans found themselves fighting a losing battle against momentum they had inadvertently created by agreeing to any changes at all. The psychological impact on Spartan identity was profound. For centuries, Spartans had defined themselves, in opposition to other Greek cities, particularly Athens, by emphasizing their superior discipline and commitment to traditional values. But as their education system became more intellectually sophisticated, the distinctions between Spartan and Athenian approaches began to blur, creating an identity crisis that affected everything from military recruitment to marriage customs. Most ironically, the success of the reforms created new problems that were in some ways more challenging than the original issues they were designed to address. While the old system had produced predictable results, tough, obedient citizens who occasionally died from the training, the new system produced unpredictable results that were harder to manage even when they were objectively better. The reformed educational system attracted new types of people to positions of influence within Spartan society, creating a more diverse but also more contentious leadership structure. These new players brought different perspectives and priorities that often conflicted with traditional Spartan approaches to governance and social organization. The most significant new figures were female educational theorists, women who had excelled under both the old and new systems and could therefore speak with authority about the differences between them. Lampion of Sparta became particularly influential as an advocate for further reforms, arguing that education should prepare girls not just for motherhood and household management, but for active participation in political and economic decision-making. Her role differed dramatically from earlier female leaders, who had typically gained influence through their relationships with powerful men or their success in traditional feminine domains. Lampeto argued for authority based on intellectual merit and educational expertise, which was a radical concept in a society that had traditionally valued physical prowess and family connections above academic achievement. Their contributions included developing new teaching methods that combined Spartan values with intellectual rigor. Instead of simply conditioning girls to endure hardship, these educators taught them to analyze situations, develop strategies, and make independent judgments about when traditional approaches were appropriate versus when innovation was necessary. It's like the difference between training someone to follow a recipe perfectly versus teaching them to understand cooking principles well enough to create their own recipes. But these new approaches created disruptions that traditional Spartan leaders hadn't anticipated. The female theorists began forming networks that operated independently of existing power structures, creating alternative sources of authority that sometimes conflicted with official policies. When these women disagreed with decisions made by the traditional male leadership, they had both the intellectual tools and the social influence to mount effective opposition. Specific stories about these new elements reveal the tensions inherent in social change. When Lampeto proposed that girls should learn mathematics and rhetoric alongside physical training, conservative officials initially dismissed her ideas as foreign corruption. But when her students began outperforming traditionally educated girls in practical problem-solving exercises, even skeptics had to acknowledge that her methods produced superior results. The most dramatic example involved a crisis during a helot uprising when traditional military commanders were struggling to develop effective counter-strategies. A group of women educated under the new system proposed an alternative approach that combined military tactics with economic pressure and psychological warfare. Their plan was initially rejected as inappropriately complex, but when traditional methods failed, desperate officials agreed to try the women's strategy. Its success created a precedent for female participation in military planning that would have been unthinkable under the old system. However, the integration of these new players wasn't smooth. Many of them had been educated to think critically and speak honestly, which often put them in conflict with the diplomatic necessities of maintaining social harmony. They would point out logical flaws in traditional practices or suggest improvements to established procedures, which was exactly what their education had trained them to do, but which also disrupted the consensus-building processes that kept Spartan society functioning. The new players also brought different definitions of success and failure that sometimes conflicted with traditional Spartan metrics. Where older leaders measured success primarily through military achievement and social stability, the newer educators emphasized intellectual development, individual fulfillment, and adaptive capacity, goals that were harder to quantify but arguably more important for long-term survival. But some problems persisted despite the educational reforms, proving that changing training methods couldn't address all of Sparta's fundamental structural issues. The helot system continued to create existential anxiety that influenced every aspect of Spartan society, including education. No matter how intellectually sophisticated Spartan women became, they still lived in constant fear of slave rebellions that could destroy their civilization overnight. Continuing challenges included the demographic crisis that had been building for generations. Sparta's population was declining not because of educational brutality, but because of warfare casualties, emigration by families who couldn't meet social expectations, and the economic strain of maintaining a military state. The reformed education system produced more capable women, but it couldn't address the underlying problem that Sparta was literally running out of Spartans. New versions of old problems emerged as the society adapted. Instead of children dying from physical abuse during training, families now struggled with psychological pressure to produce intellectually exceptional offspring. The competition shifted from purely physical domains to academic and strategic areas, but it remained just as intense and just as damaging to children who couldn't meet elevated expectations. Cyclical patterns appeared as each generation of reforms created new rigidities that the next generation would need to address. The women who had fought to introduce intellectual training eventually became conservative defenders of their reformed system, resisting further changes proposed by their own students. It's like academic departments that become so invested in their theoretical approaches that they can't adapt when new research makes their methods obsolete. Why certain issues proved intractable becomes clear when you consider the fundamental contradictions built into Spartan society. They needed citizens who were both obedient and independent, traditional and innovative, collectively minded and individually excellent. These contradictions couldn't be resolved through educational reform because they reflected deeper tensions about human nature and social organization that no training system could eliminate. The most persistent problem was the gap between Spartan ideals and Spartan reality. The education system, whether traditional or reformed, was designed to produce perfect citizens for a perfect society. But real Spartans living in the real world faced messy situations that didn't conform to any educational template. Girls trained to be warrior mothers discovered that actual motherhood involved mundane daily challenges that no amount of physical conditioning or intellectual preparation could fully address. Economic pressures created additional complications that education couldn't solve. As Sparta's military dominance declined, the state had fewer resources to invest in elaborate educational programs. The reformed system was more expensive than the traditional one because it required more specialized instructors and more complex facilities. Ironically, making education more humane also made it more expensive, which created pressure to limit access to families who could afford additional costs. Social tensions between reformed and traditional families created ongoing divisions that sometimes erupted into open conflict. Children educated under different systems had difficulty relating to each other as adults, creating marriage compatibility issues and friendship patterns that reinforced class divisions. The society that had prided itself on unity and shared values found itself fragmenting along educational lines. Perhaps most frustratingly, many of the problems that reforms were supposed to solve simply transformed rather than disappearing. Psychological trauma from brutal physical training was replaced by anxiety about academic performance. Social pressure to conform to traditional gender roles was replaced by pressure to excel in newly expanded roles. The specific sources of stress changed, but the overall level of stress remained high because the underlying competitive structure of Spartan society was unchanged. Compared to earlier periods of Spartan history, the reformed education system represented both significant progress and fundamental continuity that reveals how difficult it is for societies to change their essential character. When compared to other places in the ancient world, Sparta's educational experiments made them more similar to their neighbors while maintaining enough distinctiveness to preserve their cultural identity. What was unique about the Spartan approach was their systematic attempt to engineer human excellence through institutional design. Other societies might have elite training programs for selected individuals, but only Sparta tried to apply intensive conditioning to their entire citizen population. Even after reforms, this comprehensive approach to character development remained distinctively Spartan. Even if the specific methods became less brutal, what was universal in their experience was the discovery that educational systems reflect the values and anxieties of the societies that create them. Spartan education, whether traditional or reformed, was designed to address Spartan fears about weakness, invasion, and social collapse. Other societies facing similar threats developed their own intensive training programs, suggesting that extreme educational methods are a predictable response to existential anxiety rather than a uniquely Spartan pathology. Lessons that could be learned from the Spartan experience include both positive and negative examples of how societies can modify their child-rearing practices. On the positive side, the reforms demonstrated that even deeply entrenched systems can be changed when practical necessity makes change unavoidable. The success of modified training methods proved that effective education doesn't require systematic brutality, which should be encouraging to anyone trying to reform harsh institutional practices. On the negative side, the Spartan experience showed how difficult it is to predict the long-term consequences of educational changes. The reforms that made Spartan women more capable also made them more independent, which created new social tensions that the reformers hadn't anticipated. This suggests that societies attempting educational reform should prepare for unintended consequences that might be as challenging as the original problems. Patterns that repeated elsewhere in history include the tendency for educational reforms to create generational conflicts, the difficulty of maintaining institutional change over time, and the way that reforms often solve some problems while creating others. Modern educational systems facing pressure to change can learn from Sparta's experience that reform is possible but complicated, beneficial but unpredictable, and necessary but never sufficient to address all of a society's underlying challenges. The most important comparative lesson might be that educational systems are only as effective as the societies they serve, and that changing training methods without addressing broader social problems is like treating symptoms while ignoring the disease dog by the 4th century BCE. Signs pointed to the end of Sparta's unique educational experiment, though, like many dying institutions, it took decades to actually expire and spent most of that time insisting it was in perfect health. The warning signs were everywhere for anyone willing to see them. But Spartan culture had spent centuries training people to ignore inconvenient realities. So most citizens remained optimistic, even as their civilization crumbled around them. Warning. Signs included the obvious ones: military defeats, population decline, economic problems, but also subtler indicators that the education system itself was becoming obsolete. The girls graduating from even the reform programs were increasingly choosing to emigrate rather than remain in Sparta, taking their talents to cities that offer better opportunities for educated women. It's like if Harvard Medical School graduates started consistently choosing to practice medicine in other countries because the U.S. healthcare system was too dysfunctional to work in. What key players could see versus what they missed reveals the psychological blindness that often accompanies institutional decline. Military leaders recognized that Spartan armies were losing battles, but they attributed this to insufficient discipline rather than fundamental strategic obsolescence. Educational officials acknowledged that fewer families were willing to subject their children to traditional training, but they blamed this on foreign corruption rather than recognizing the parents were making rational choices about their children's futures. The most perceptive observers were often the women who had succeeded under both the old and reformed systems. They could see that the skill Spartan education developed physical toughness, unquestioning obedience, and narrow specialization in military affairs were becoming less valuable in a world that increasingly rewarded intellectual flexibility, diplomatic skill, and economic innovation. But their warnings were often dismissed because they came from people who were supposed to be grateful beneficiaries of the system rather than its critics. Resistance to inevitable change took predictable forms. Conservative factions argued that Sparta's problems were caused by insufficient commitment to traditional values rather than by the obsolescence of those values. They proposed solutions that involved returning to earlier, more brutal educational methods, apparently believing that if some child abuse was good, more child abuse would be better. It's like treating a computer virus by going back to an older operating system that's even more vulnerable to modern threats. The psychological dynamics of this resistance were fascinating and depressing. Spartan leaders had invested their entire identities in the belief that their system was superior to all alternatives. Admitting that the system was failing would have required acknowledging that their life's work had been based on false premises, which was psychologically impossible for many people who had sacrificed everything for Spartan ideals. Perhaps most tragically, the resistance to change often came from the very people who had suffered most under the traditional system. Mothers who had endured brutal training themselves sometimes became the most passionate defenders of subjecting their daughters to similar experiences, apparently believing that if they admitted the training was harmful, they would also have to admit that their own suffering had been meaningless. How the era of Spartan educational brutality ended was less like a dramatic collapse and more like a slow-motion implosion, where each attempt to solve problems created new problems until the entire system became too complicated and expensive to maintain. The final blow came not from external conquest, but from internal exhaustion. Sparta simply ran out of people willing to participate in their own civilization's unique brand of institutionalized masochism. The specific events that marked the end included the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, where a Spartan army was decisively defeated by Theban forces using tactics that Spartan training hadn't prepared them to counter. But more significantly for our story, the aftermath of this defeat saw the first mass exodus of Spartan families. including many who took their daughters out of the traditional education system and relocated to cities, where children could grow up without systematic trauma. Final major players in this drama included King Cleomenes III, who attempted to revive Spartan power through radical social reforms in the 3rd century BCE. His programs included modifications to girls' education that were supposedly designed to restore traditional values, but actually represented a complete departure from classical Spartan methods. Instead of brutal physical conditioning, girls were trained in rhetoric, mathematics, and political theory, essentially a liberal arts education disguised as military preparation. The last attempts to preserve the system took on increasingly desperate and absurd characteristics. Officials tried to make the training more appealing by reducing its physical demands while maintaining its psychological intensity, creating a version of Spartan education that was simultaneously less effective and more annoying than the original. It's like trying to make military boot camp more popular by adding comfortable chairs and motivational speakers while keeping all the psychological abuse. Some families attempted to create private versions of traditional Spartan education, hiring tutors to put their daughters through modified versions of the classical training. But without the institutional support and social pressure that had made the original system effective, these private programs often devolved into expensive cosplay rather than genuine character development. Rich families could afford to indulge in nostalgia for traditional values without actually subjecting their children to traditional consequences. The dramatic final moments came when the last official festival of Artemis Orthia was held around 146 BCE, shortly before Sparta was absorbed into the Roman Empire. Contemporary accounts describe a pathetic spectacle where a handful of girls went through the motions of traditional trials, while most of the audience consisted of Roman tourists who had come to see the famous Spartan brutality as a kind of historical curiosity. The symbolic endpoints varied depending on your perspective. For the girls themselves, the end came when families stopped sending their daughters to official training programs and started educating them at home or in other cities. For the trainers and officials, the end came when the state stopped funding educational programs and they had to find other employment. For Spartan society as a whole, the end was more gradual, a slow transformation from a unique military culture into a generic provincial town that happened to have an interesting history. Perhaps most ironically, the final generations of Spartan girls educated under the traditional system often became the most effective advocates for ending it. They had experienced the training firsthand, understood both its benefits and its costs, and concluded that the costs had become unjustifiable in the modern world. Their testimony carried special weight because it couldn't be dismissed as foreign propaganda or weak-minded sentimentality. The last official documents related to girls' education in Sparta are bureaucratic records from the Roman period, showing payments to teachers who provided conventional Greek education to local children. These records are notable for their complete ordinariness. No mention of character building through suffering, number references to producing warrior mothers, just routine administrative notes about paying people to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic to kids. The transformation from unique cultural institution to mundane educational bureaucracy was complete. Analysis of the causes reveals that Sparta's educational system didn't fail because it was too harsh or because people became more enlightened about child welfare. It failed because it became strategically obsolete in a world that no longer rewarded the specific qualities it was designed to produce, while simultaneously becoming too expensive and complicated to maintain in its reformed versions. Internal problems included the demographic crisis that had been building for centuries. Sparta's population had been declining due to warfare casualties, emigration, and low birth rates among families who found the social pressure unbearable. By the 4th century BCE, there simply weren't enough Spartan families left to sustain the elaborate institutional infrastructure required for their educational system. It's like trying to maintain a specialized medical program when you don't have enough patients to justify the expense. External pressures came from military and economic changes that made Spartan specialization a liability rather than an asset. The rise of professional armies, naval warfare, siege technology, and diplomatic complexity meant that success required diverse skills, rather than narrow expertise in traditional infantry tactics. Spartan education produced people who were excellent at one specific type of warfare, but helpless when faced with different challenges. The role of individuals versus historical forces creates interesting questions about whether the end was inevitable or could have been prevented with different leadership. Some historians argue that more flexible leaders could have adapted the system to changing circumstances, while others contend that the fundamental contradictions in Spartan society made collapse unavoidable, regardless of individual choices. What could have been done differently is a subject of endless speculation. Some possibilities include earlier and more comprehensive educational reforms, economic diversification to reduce dependence on military success, or political changes that would have made Spartan society more appealing to its own citizens. But all of these alternatives would have required abandoning core Spartan values, which raises the question of whether a reformed Sparta would still have been recognizably Spartan. Inevitability versus contingency remains hotly debated among scholars. The inevitability argument suggests that any society built on systematic brutality and rigid social control will eventually exhaust itself and become obsolete as the world changes around it. The contingency argument points to specific decisions and events that could have gone differently, potentially allowing Sparta to adapt and survive. The most compelling analysis might be that Sparta faced a classic evolutionary dilemma. They had become so perfectly adapted to one specific environmental niche that they couldn't survive when that niche disappeared. Their educational system was incredibly effective at producing a particular type of person for a particular type of society. But when both the people and the society were no longer optimal for their environment, the system became a liability rather than an asset. Modern parallels include any institution that becomes so specialized that it can't adapt to changing circumstances. Military academies that train officers for wars that will never be fought. Business schools that prepare managers for economic conditions that no longer exist, and educational systems that develop skills that technology has made obsolete, all face similar challenges to what ancient Sparta experienced. The lesson seems to be that no matter how successful a system is in, the short-term, long-term survival requires maintaining the capacity for change and adaptation. Sparta's educational system was remarkably effective at achieving its immediate goals, but it was also remarkably bad at evolving when those goals became counterproductive. The immediate aftermath of Sparta's educational collapse was a mixture of relief, nostalgia, and confusion as Greek society tried to figure out what to do with generations of people who had been trained for a world that no longer existed. The vacuum left by Spartan educational authority was filled by a combination of Roman administrative efficiency and Greek intellectual traditions that were both more humane and more practical than what they replaced. Who stepped into the vacuum varied by region and social class. In Sparta itself, Roman administrators established conventional schools that provided basic education without the psychological conditioning that had characterized the classical system. Wealthy families hired private tutors who often came from Athens or other intellectual centers, bringing educational approaches that emphasized literature, philosophy, and rhetoric over physical conditioning and military training. Short-term consequences included a generation of young Spartan women who were caught between systems, too old to be educated under Roman methods, but too young to have completed classical Spartan training. These transitional figures often struggled to find their place in a society that was rapidly abandoning the values they had been raised to embody. Many emigrated to other Greek cities, where their partial Spartan education was seen as exotic rather than obsolete. Contemporary reactions to the end of the system were surprisingly mixed. While most people outside Sparta celebrated the end of what they saw as institutionalized child abuse, some Greek intellectuals worried that something valuable was being lost along with the obvious problems. They argued that Spartan education, despite its flaws, had produced people with remarkable physical and mental toughness that might be needed in an uncertain world. Attempts at revival or continuation took various forms, mostly unsuccessful. Some Roman nobles became fascinated with Spartan methods and tried to implement modified versions for their own children. But without the social infrastructure that had made the original system effective, these attempts usually produced spoiled aristocrats with delusions of military grandeur rather than genuinely capable individuals. The most successful continuations were indirect military training programs that borrowed specific techniques from Spartan education while abandoning its broader philosophical framework. Roman legions adopted some Spartan conditioning methods, but applied them to voluntary adult recruits rather than involuntary children, which made them both more humane and more effective. Perhaps most tellingly, many former Spartan educational officials found employment as consultants to other societies that wanted to improve their military training programs. But their advice was typically about specific techniques rather than comprehensive lifestyle systems, suggesting that even the experts recognized that classical Spartan education was no longer viable as a complete approach to child development. The legacy of Spartan girls' education shaped later developments in ways that were both more subtle and more pervasive than most people realize. While the specific brutalities of the agoge were rarely copied exactly, the underlying logic that exceptional results require exceptional methods, and that society has the right to subject children to systematic hardship for their own good, became a recurring theme in Western educational philosophy that persists to this day. Specific influences can be traced through Roman military academies, medieval monastic schools, and early modern boarding institutions, all of which borrowed elements of Spartan conditioning while claiming to improve upon it. The Romans were particularly fascinated by Spartan methods, but they typically applied them to voluntary adult recruits rather than involuntary children, which made them both more ethical and more effective. Still, the basic principle that character is built through controlled suffering became a cornerstone of elite military training that continues today. How later generations viewed Spartan education reveals the power of historical mythology to override historical reality. Renaissance humanists idealized Sparta as a model of civic virtue and educational excellence, conveniently ignoring the systematic child abuse while celebrating the results. This selective memory created a romanticized version of Spartan education that influenced educational reformers for centuries, most of whom had never actually studied what Spartan training involved in practice. The myths versus realities that developed around Spartan education became more influential than the historical facts. By the 18th century, Enlightenment philosophers were praising Spartan educational methods as examples of rational, state-directed character development, apparently, forgetting that the system had collapsed precisely because it was neither rational nor effective in changing circumstances. The gap between romantic idealization and brutal reality became so wide that people could simultaneously celebrate Spartan education and condemn child abuse without recognizing the contradiction. Why it remained important to some thinkers had less to do with the actual effectiveness of Spartan methods than with their symbolic value as an alternative to what these thinkers saw as the softness and corruption of their own societies. Spartan education became a rhetorical weapon for anyone who wanted to argue that their contemporaries were insufficiently tough, disciplined, or committed to collective values. It didn't matter whether Spartan methods actually worked. What mattered was that they represented an extreme alternative to whatever educational approach the critic wanted to attack. The academic study of Spartan education has been complicated by this legacy of romanticization. Serious historians have had to work against centuries of propaganda that portrayed Sparta as either an ideal society or a cautionary tale, when the reality was probably somewhere in between. The challenge is separating what actually happened from what people wanted to believe happened, and understanding both the genuine achievements and the genuine costs of the Spartan system. Perhaps most ironically, the historical impact of Spartan education has been greatest in societies that would have horrified actual Spartans. Modern democratic nations regularly invoke Spartan educational ideals while practicing educational methods that ancient Spartans would have considered dangerously permissive. The symbolic Sparta of political rhetoric bears little resemblance to the historical Sparta of archaeological evidence, but the symbolic version has been far more influential in shaping modern educational debates. The persistence of Spartan educational mythology suggests something important about human psychology and social organization. People seem drawn to the idea that extraordinary results require extraordinary sacrifice, even when evidence suggests that less extreme methods might be more effective. The enduring appeal of tough love educational philosophies, despite their mixed track record, reflects the same psychological dynamics that made Spartan education seem reasonable to ancient Greeks who should have known better. Today, we can see echoes of Spartan educational logic in environments that range from elite military academies to competitive youth sports programs, and the similarities are often more disturbing than the differences. While modern institutions rarely subject children to the systematic physical brutality that characterized ancient Sparta, they often employ psychological pressure, artificial scarcity, and competitive elimination that serve similar functions. In breaking down individual identity and rebuilding it according to institutional specifications, specific parallels are easiest to identify in military training programs, which still operate on fundamentally Spartan principles. Modern boot camps deliberately subject recruits to physical hardship, sleep deprivation, psychological stress, and social humiliation, justifying these methods as necessary for building the mental toughness required for combat effectiveness. The techniques have been refined and the rhetoric has been updated, but the underlying logic that character is built through controlled suffering remains unchanged from ancient Sparta. What hasn't changed about human nature becomes apparent when you look at how modern parents react to intensive educational programs. Just as ancient Spartan families competed to demonstrate their commitment to state values by subjecting their children to increasingly harsh training, modern families compete to demonstrate their commitment to success by enrolling their children in increasingly demanding programs. The specific metrics have changed from military prowess to academic achievement or athletic performance, but the willingness to sacrifice children's immediate well-being for long-term competitive advantage remains constant. Similar patterns in different contexts can be found in elite academic programs that pride themselves on their rigor, competitive youth sports leagues that celebrate character building through adversity, and performing arts schools that normalize psychological pressure as the price of excellence. These institutions often produce impressive results, just as Spartan education did, but they also create casualties that are conveniently ignored when calculating success rates. The competitive parenting culture that has emerged in affluent societies bears uncomfortable similarities to Spartan family dynamics. Modern parents may not subject their children to physical whippings, but they subject them to academic pressure, social competition, and psychological stress that serves similar functions. The goal is still to produce children who can outcompete their peers, and the methods still involve systematic conditioning that prioritizes performance over psychological well-being. Youth sports provide, perhaps, the clearest modern parallel to Spartan educational methods. Elite programs regularly subject children to training regimens that would have been familiar to ancient Spartan trainers. Physical conditioning that pushes participants to their limits, psychological pressure designed to eliminate weakness, and competitive elimination systems that create artificial scarcity. The justifications are remarkably similar: building character, preparing for real-world competition, and producing excellence through adversity. Even more disturbing are the modern institutions that explicitly model themselves on imagined versions of Spartan education. Military boarding schools, wilderness therapy programs, and tough love rehabilitation centers often invoke Spartan ideals while subjecting children to conditions that range from rigorous to abusive. These programs attract parents who believe their children need to be toughened up, usually without investigating whether the methods actually achieve the desired results or simply create trauma disguised as character development. The technology has changed, but the psychology remains the same. Instead of abandoning weak infants on mountainsides, modern societies use standardized testing, competitive admissions, and tracking systems to sort children into categories that determine their future opportunities. Instead of public festivals where girls demonstrate their worthiness for citizenship, we have college admissions processes that require teenagers to present themselves as perfect specimens of academic and extracurricular achievement. Perhaps most tellingly, modern societies still struggle with the same fundamental question that plagued ancient Sparta. How do you prepare children for a competitive world without destroying their humanity in the process? The specific challenges have evolved. We worry about academic pressure instead of military preparation, social media instead of public humiliation, college admissions instead of citizenship trials. But the underlying dilemma remains unchanged. The persistence of these patterns suggests that the Spartan approach to education addresses something fundamental about human anxiety regarding child development and social competition. Parents want their children to succeed. Societies want citizens who can meet challenges, and institutions want to produce measurable results. The temptation to achieve these goals through systematic pressure and controlled hardship appears to be universal, regardless of historical context or cultural values. Even now, Spartan educational ideals influence modern areas in ways that are often unrecognized by the people implementing policies that would have made ancient Spartan officials proud. Academic study of grit and resilience frequently references Spartan examples, usually without acknowledging the human costs that made those examples possible. The research literature on character development through adversity often treats Spartan education as a successful case study rather than a cautionary tale. Popular culture has been particularly influential in perpetuating romanticized versions of Spartan educational methods. Movies, books, and television shows regularly portray intense training programs as necessary for producing heroes, using Spartan-inspired imagery and rhetoric to justify putting fictional characters through experiences that would be considered abusive in real life. These portrayals shape public perceptions about what constitutes appropriate challenge versus inappropriate cruelty in educational settings. Political discourse regularly invokes Spartan educational ideals when discussing everything from military recruitment to public school reform. Politicians who want to appear tough on education often propose policies that echo Spartan logic: higher standards, more rigorous testing, elimination of weak programs, and greater emphasis on competition and individual responsibility. The specific policies may be different, but the underlying assumption that educational problems can be solved by making things harder for children remains fundamentally Spartan. Social movements have also appropriated Spartan educational rhetoric for various causes. advocates for military preparedness programs in schools, supporters of competitive academic tracking, and proponents of character education through adversity all draw on Spartan examples to support their positions. Even critics of modern educational softness often invoke Spartan comparisons, arguing that contemporary children are insufficiently prepared for real-world challenges. Why people still care about Spartan education reflects deeper anxieties about modern life that the ancient systems seem to address. In an era of global competition, economic uncertainty, and social change, the Spartan model offers the appealing fantasy that there are simple, if harsh, solutions to complex problems. The idea that character can be systematically developed through controlled hardship provides comfort to people who worry that modern children are too sheltered, too privileged, or too unprepared for adult responsibilities. Professional development and corporate training programs frequently borrow Spartan-inspired techniques, subjecting employees to intensive workshops that promise to build leadership skills through artificial challenges and competitive exercises. Management consultants regularly recommend boot camp approaches to organizational change that echo ancient Spartan methods, usually without acknowledging that the original system collapsed precisely because it couldn't adapt to changing circumstances. The continuing influence of Spartan educational ideals suggests that the fundamental questions they attempted to answer, how to develop human potential, how to prepare people for challenges, how to balance individual development with collective needs, remain as relevant today as they were 2,500 years ago, even if the specific answers the Spartans provided have proven inadequate. Looking back, across our journey through the nightmare that was being a teenage girl in ancient Sparta, we've seen how a society could systematically normalize what we would now recognize as child abuse, while genuinely believing they were creating superior human beings. The major themes that emerge from this exploration reveal patterns that are both historically specific and disturbingly universal. The willingness to sacrifice individual well-being for collective goals, the belief that character is built through suffering, and the tendency for institutions to become so invested in their methods that they lose sight of their original purposes. Key patterns that emerge throughout our story include the cycle of trauma that perpetuated the system. Survivors often became the most passionate defenders of subjecting the next generation to similar experiences, apparently believing that admitting the system was harmful would invalidate their own suffering. We saw how societies can create elaborate justifications for practices that serve institutional needs rather than individual development, and how success stories can be used to obscure systematic failures. The most surprising discoveries might be how rational and well-intentioned the Spartan system appeared to its practitioners. These weren't cartoonish villains who enjoyed tormenting children. They were ordinary people who had convinced themselves that extreme measures were necessary for survival and success. The trainers, judges, and parents who implemented these policies genuinely believed they were helping children reach their potential and preparing them for a dangerous world. Most important takeaways from this exploration include the recognition that institutional abuse often masquerades as character development, that exceptional results don't necessarily justify exceptional methods, and that societies can normalize almost anything if they're sufficiently motivated by fear or ambition. The Spartan experience demonstrates how quickly temporary emergency measures can become permanent features of social organization, and how difficult it becomes to question practices once they're embedded in cultural identity. How our understanding has evolved throughout this journey reveals the complexity of historical judgment. What initially appeared to be simply a story about ancient brutality became a more nuanced examination of how societies balance competing values: individual welfare versus collective security, tradition versus adaptation, excellence versus humanity. The Spartan system wasn't just cruel. It was a comprehensive attempt to solve real problems through methods that ultimately proved counterproductive. Perhaps most importantly, we've seen how the fundamental questions that drove Spartan educational philosophy, how to prepare children for adult challenges, how to develop individual potential within social constraints, how to maintain cultural values while adapting to changing circumstances, remain as relevant today as they were 2,500 years ago. The specific answers the Spartans provided may have been wrong, but the questions they were trying to answer continue to challenge every society that cares about the development of its young people. The journey has also revealed how easy it is for modern observers to feel superior to ancient practices while ignoring similar dynamics in contemporary institutions. The distance of time and cultural difference makes Spartan brutality obvious, but the same psychological mechanisms that enabled ancient child abuse continue to operate in modern contexts that we might not recognize as problematic. One final compelling anecdote encapsulates everything we've learned about the human cost and psychological complexity of the Spartan system. In 380 BC, an elderly Spartan woman named Archidamia was interviewed by a visiting philosopher about her experiences as both a survivor of the traditional education system and a mother who had sent 3 daughters through various versions of the reformed training. Her responses, recorded in fragments that survived in later sources, reveal the psychological contortions required to function in a society built on institutionalized trauma. When asked about her own childhood training, Archidamia described the physical conditioning with pride, emphasizing how it had prepared her for the hardships of adult life. She spoke of learning to endure pain without complaint, to compete without mercy, and to value collective success over individual comfort. But when pressed about specific memories, her responses became more complex. She remembered the fear of failing public tests, the anxiety about disappointing trainers, and the constant pressure to prove her worthiness for citizenship. Why this story encapsulates the broader themes becomes clear when you consider her contradictory attitudes toward her daughter's education. Her eldest daughter had been educated under the traditional system and had excelled, becoming a model Spartan citizen who married well and produced successful children. Archidamia spoke of this daughter with obvious pride, crediting the brutal training with developing her strength and character. But her second daughter had been educated during the early reform period and had struggled with the mixed messages of a system that demanded both obedience and critical thinking. This daughter had eventually emigrated to Athens, where she became a successful businesswoman, but was considered a failure by Spartan standards. Archidamia's feelings about this daughter were complicated. She was proud of her achievements, but ashamed of her choices. Her youngest daughter had been educated under the fully reformed system and had thrived intellectually while struggling physically. She had become an influential educational theorist who advocated for further reforms, which put her in direct opposition to her mother's values. Archidamia loved this daughter, but felt that her success represented a rejection of everything Spartan culture valued. What this reveals about the system's impact on human psychology is profound. Archidamia had internalized Spartan values so completely that she measured her own children's worth by standards that caused her personal anguish. She simultaneously celebrated and mourned each daughter's path, unable to fully embrace any outcome because the system had taught her to value contradictory things. How it connects to everything we've discussed becomes apparent when you realize that Archidamia's story could be told about parents in any era who sacrificed their children's immediate well-being for long-term competitive advantage. The specific details change: ancient military training versus modern academic pressure, citizenship trials versus college admissions, but the fundamental dynamic remains the same. The memorable final image that emerges from Archidamia's story is of an elderly woman sitting in her garden, surrounded by the artifacts of a lifetime spent in service to a system she could neither fully embrace nor completely reject. She had succeeded by Spartan standards, but success had required her to accept the systematic traumatization of her own children as normal and necessary. Her story reminds us that the human cost of institutional brutality includes not just the obvious victims, but also the survivors who must live with the knowledge that they participated in perpetuating a system that harmed the people they loved most. As we reach the end of our exploration into this ancient nightmare, it's worth reflecting on what we've learned about human nature, institutional power, and the eternal challenge of raising children in an uncertain world. The story of Spartan girls' education isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a mirror that reflects our own assumptions about what children need, what society owes its young people, and what price we're willing to pay for excellence. The gentle conclusion that emerges from this journey isn't that the ancients were uniquely brutal, or that we moderns are uniquely enlightened. Instead, it's that human beings in every era face similar pressures and temptations when it comes to child rearing, and that the specific methods we choose often say more about our fears than our wisdom. The Spartans were terrified of weakness, invasion, and social collapse, so they created an educational system designed to eliminate those threats. We're terrified of competition, failure, and irrelevance, so we create educational systems designed to eliminate those threats. The underlying psychology hasn't changed much. What's encouraging about the Spartan experience is that even the most entrenched systems can be modified when people recognize that they're no longer serving their intended purposes. The educational reforms that eventually replace pure brutality with more sophisticated approaches didn't happen because Spartans suddenly became more compassionate. They happened because practical necessity forced adaptation. This suggests that positive change is possible even in rigid institutional environments, though it often takes external pressure to motivate internal reform. What's discouraging is how long it took for those changes to occur, how much human suffering was accepted as normal during the transition period, and how easily societies can convince themselves that extreme measures are justified by exceptional circumstances. The Spartan system persisted for centuries, partly because it did produce some impressive results, and those success stories were used to justify continuing practices that cause systematic harm to thousands of children. The invitation to reflection that emerges from this story is to consider how our own educational institutions, parenting practices, and social expectations might appear to future observers. Are we creating unnecessary suffering in pursuit of goals that might not be as important as we think they are? Are we so focused on preparing children for competition that we're forgetting to prepare them for cooperation, creativity, and psychological well-being? Perhaps most importantly, are we falling into the same trap that caught ancient Sparta, becoming so invested in our methods that we lose sight of our purposes? The Spartans started with the reasonable goal of producing capable citizens who could defend their society, but they became so obsessed with their specific approach to achieving that goal that they couldn't adapt when circumstances changed. Modern societies risk similar blindness when they become too attached to particular educational philosophies, parenting styles, or institutional structures. The peaceful closing thought that emerges from this historical nightmare is both sobering and hopeful. Sobering because it reminds us how easily ordinary people can participate in systems that cause genuine harm to children when those systems are presented as necessary for success or survival. Hopeful because it demonstrates that human beings are capable of recognizing when their approaches aren't working and making changes, even when those changes require admitting that previous generations suffered unnecessarily. The ultimate lesson from the Spartan experience might be that the goal of education, whether ancient or modern, should be to help children develop their full human potential rather than to mold them into predetermined shapes that serve institutional needs. This sounds obvious, but it's surprisingly easy to lose sight of when we're caught up in competitive pressures, cultural expectations, and our own anxieties about preparing children for adult challenges. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can appreciate that, for all the flaws in modern educational systems, most children today will never face the systematic brutality that Spartan girls endured as a normal part of growing up. Most parents today recognize that their primary obligation is to nurture their children's development, rather than to prove their loyalty to state values through child-rearing practices. But we can also use the Spartan example as a reminder to stay vigilant about the institutions we create and support in the name of helping children succeed. The trainers, judges, and parents who implement Spartan educational policies weren't monsters. They were people who had convinced themselves that extreme measures were necessary for positive outcomes. The same psychological mechanisms that enabled their choices continue to operate today, and it's our responsibility to recognize them before they lead us down similar paths. The story of being a teenage girl in ancient Sparta ultimately teaches us that societies get the educational systems they deserve based on their values, fears, and priorities. If we want educational systems that truly serve children's needs rather than adult anxieties, we have to be willing to examine our own assumptions about what children need and what we're trying to achieve through our child-rearing practices. Sweet dreams, and remember, whatever challenges you faced as a teenager, at least you never had to wrestle your classmates naked while being evaluated for citizenship by a panel of elderly officials. Sometimes historical perspective really does help.